History preserves this moment as one of the most absurd and tragic accidents in the annals of humanity. The silence at the forest's edge was not torn by a war cry, nor by the clash of steel. It was shattered by a bestial roar. A massive bull, transported across the ocean in the hold of a Viking ship, broke loose from its pen and filled the surroundings with a furious bellow. To a Scandinavian, this sound signified a full belly, home, and plowed fields. But to the indigenous inhabitants of America, who had never encountered horned cattle, it sounded like the voice of a monster from the underworld. The panic that flared within the ranks of the natives instantly jeopardized a peaceful trade exchange. And so, because of one frightened animal, a grandiose dream of colonizing the New World 5 centuries before Columbus was placed under threat. In the previous episode, Leif Erikson, known as the Lucky, paved the way to Vinland and returned a victor without ever unsheathing his sword. He gave the Greenlanders hope for a new paradise. But a map is not the same as possession of territory. Today, we will follow the man who risked not just visiting these shores, but establishing a permanent foothold upon them. Unlike Eric the Red, Thorfinn Karlsefni was not considered an exile. He did not require the glory of a discoverer like Leif. A pragmatic investor and the wealthiest merchant of his time, he staked his entire fortune on the most audacious enterprise of the Middle Ages. The paradox of this saga shatters stereotypes about the Norsemen. The fiercest warriors of Europe arrived on the shores of America not for plunder. They came with an offer of trade. And it was this attempt at peaceful coexistence that provoked the First Intercontinental War. In this episode, we will find out why a successful tycoon traded the safety of his ancestral estate for deadly risk in wild forests, how Gudrid Torbjörndaughter transformed from a widow into the chief ideologue of expansion and the mother of the first European born across the ocean, and what price the Vikings paid to realize a simple truth: Iron Age superiority is powerless in the face of a demographic abyss. Before us lies the story of the collapse of the Viking American dream. You will see how a handful of 60 men and 5 women attempted to hold an entire continent, how an exchange of furs turned into a rain of arrows, and how Thorfinn Karlsefni, having lost not a single battle, made the hardest decision of all: to retreat, preserving his gold but abandoning the great goal. We will study the anatomy of a defeat that looks more dignified than many victories. The saga of Thorfinn Karlsefni proves sometimes courage is shown not in the readiness to die, but in the ability to leave in time, protecting the future of one's kin. The ships are loaded, the livestock is driven into the holds. We set our course for Vinland to attempt to make it our home. Autumn, 1009 AD. A heavy trading Nor enters the harbor of Brattahlid, the capital of Greenland. Its gunwales sit deep in the water under a cargo of goods more valuable to the local settlers than gold: Norwegian iron, grain, and timber suitable for building. A man steps ashore whose appearance differs strikingly from our habitual image of a Viking. Before us is not a berserker thirsting to crack skulls, nor an exile fleeing royal wrath. Thorfinn Karlsefni has not arrived here to seek salvation. He has arrived to close deals. The sagas depict him as a man of great means and a successful merchant from a noble Icelandic lineage. If Eric the Red served as a battering ram breaking down walls, and Leif was a visionary peering beyond the horizon, then Thorfinn Karlsefni appears as a cold-blooded investor. Greenland does not seem like a sanctuary to him. To him, it is a marketplace, one that is, however, dangerously cramped. Spending the winter as a guest of Leif Erikson, Thorfinn soberly assesses the resources of the Greenlandic Empire. His gaze catches not the grandeur of the explorers, but an economic dead end. Resources are depleted. There is no timber. The livestock is gradually degenerating. The colony, squeezed between the glacier and the ocean, is in desperate need of raw materials just to survive. It is in Leif's longhouse, by the crackling hearth, that Karlsefni hears the tales of Vinland. Where others saw an adventure, Thorfinn recognized a promising asset. Endless pastures that do not need to be cleared of stones, forests that can be felled without regard for the crown, furs for which Europe would pay a fortune. For the pragmatic merchant, Vinland ceases to be a myth and turns into a business plan. However, realizing such an ambitious project requires not only capital, it requires rights to the legacy. That same winter, Karlsefni makes a key strategic move. He marries Gudrid Torbjornardóttir. Look closely at this woman. Her biography already lists storms, prophecies, and the death of her first husband, Thorstein, Leif's brother, who died attempting to reach America. Gudrid transforms into a living bridge to the clan of Eric the Red. This marriage unites Karlsefni's colossal finances with the political weight of the discoverer's family. Now Thorfinn has the funds, the influence, and the map. It remains only to assemble the expedition. This time, no one speaks of simple reconnaissance. In the port of Brattahlid, preparations for a massive migration unfold. Karlsefni does not intend to simply visit Vinland and return, as Leif did. He plans to take this continent for himself. The flotilla he equips has no parallel in the history of Western Viking expeditions. Into the holds of 3 ships they load not only weapons and provisions. With immense difficulty, they drag livestock on board: sheep, cows, and a massive breeding bull. Transporting such a giant in a narrow hold across the North Atlantic was a true logistical challenge for the crew. But this is a clear signal. The Vikings are bringing their ecosystem. They intend not to raid, but to plow, sow, and breed herds. The saga of the Greenlanders has preserved the exact numbers. 60 men and 5 women board the ships. 5 women. This is the guarantee of the future, a promise that the cry of children will sound in the new world. Thorfinn Karlsefni stands at the stern, overseeing the loading. He is confident of success. He has the best vessels, superior weapons, and the support of an influential family. His calculations account for everything: winds, currents, food reserves. He made only one mistake. The merchant believed that the land in the west was an empty asset waiting for an efficient owner. He did not suspect that the place was already taken, and that the most important cargo of his expedition, that very bull, now mooing discontentedly in the hold, would play a more fatal role in the colony's history than all the swords of his warband. The ships raise their sails. The Viking-American dream begins. The journey through the Davis Strait passed surprisingly calmly. It seemed the Atlantic itself decided to give these daredevils a head start. When the fog lifted, a picture opened up before the settlers that made the stern Greenlanders freeze at the railings. They had not arrived in the stone sack of Helluland, nor the dense thickets of Markland. The ships entered a bay known in the sagas as Hop, a tidal lagoon. Look at this landscape through the eyes of a man who has spent his entire life among glaciers and black rocks. Thorfinn Karlsefni steps ashore. His boot sinks not into frozen peat, but into soft sand. The air here does not cut the lungs with cold. It is thick, saturated with aromas that make the northerners' heads spin. The saga of Eric the Red has preserved the details of this botanical shock for us. In the lowlands, the colonists find fields of self-sown wheat, wild grains suitable for bread. And on the high ground, winding around tree trunks, grows that for which Leif risked his life: grapevines. For an 11th century Scandinavian, this is not just a berry, it is a symbol. Grapes grow only in the south, in the lands of Romans and Franks, where kings live. The vine is a sure sign that they have landed in a climatic paradise. But the strongest shock is felt not by the humans. The livestock are led down the ship's ramps. Cows and sheep, languishing for months in cramped holds, stumble onto solid ground. In Greenland, these animals would be kept in the darkness of barns for most of the year, fed on meager stalks of hay. Here, endless pastures of lush grass spread out before them. Karlsefni decides not to occupy Leif's old structures, but to found a new, larger settlement. The Vikings begin their work. The sound of axes rings out over the lagoon. But this time, they are erecting not temporary shelters, but full-fledged longhouses, steads built to last for centuries. The colonists' confidence grows with each passing day. The rivers teem with fish, the forests are full of game, the land seems empty and hospitable. Winter arrives. It is in this season that all illusions usually crumble in the north. A Greenlandic winter is death, cold, and hunger. But in Vinland, the incredible happens. Snow hardly falls. The livestock continue to graze in the open air, foraging for fodder. For Thorfinn the Enterpriser, this means colossal savings. He does not need to waste energy harvesting tons of hay. Nature itself feeds his assets. In this atmosphere of absolute prosperity, an event occurs that becomes a seal securing the northerners' right to this continent. In one of the new houses, to the sound of warm rain, Gudrid Torbjarnardóttir gives birth to a son. The boy is named Snorri. Think about the significance of this fact. Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European born in the New World. Not a conqueror who came with a sword, but a native inhabitant by right of birth. The arrival of the infant changes everything. The expedition ceases to be a commercial enterprise. It transforms into a homeland. The cry of newborn Snorri sounds like a declaration: "We are here forever." Thorfinn stands on the threshold of his house, looking out at the bay. He has everything: fertile land, healthy livestock, an heir, and a wife who supports his ambitions. His plan worked perfectly. He found Eden. But this paradise had a dark side. The silence of Vinland forests is deceptive. The Scandinavians made the same mistake as Leif. They assumed this garden was created specifically for them. They did not notice that from behind the trees, hundreds of eyes had been watching them for long. The idyll ends. Shadows emerge from the forest. The morning of that day foretold no trouble. Fog hung over the bay, cattle grazed lazily, and the women attended to chores near the longhouses. The idyll was broken by a sound. Neither a war horn nor the ring of steel disturbed the air. From the water came a rhythmic, growing noise, as if hundreds of flails were threshing grain. Thorfinn Karlsefni walks out to the shore and freezes. The sea, which seemed empty just yesterday, has turned black with boats. Dozens of canoes dot the surface, as if charcoal had been scattered upon the water. For the first time in history, two branches of humanity, separated tens of thousands of years ago, look into each other's eyes. The Europeans call these people skraelings, wretches or shriveled ones. The saga of Eric the Great has preserved this gaze, full of arrogance and fear. They were small men, ill-looking, with broad cheekbones and large, restless eyes. The indigenous people of America see before them bearded giants clad in iron, arriving on huge winged ships. The air rings with tension. One wrong gesture, one released bowstring, and the beach will turn into a graveyard. But Thorfinn makes a move that reveals him not as a berserker, but as a calculating merchant. He orders his men to raise a white shield. In Viking culture, a red shield meant war, a white one, peace. A universal gesture, understandable even to those who had never seen iron. The Indians accept the signal. The boats touch the sand. The first meeting of worlds in history begins. Let us look at this scene through the prism of economics. The Skraelings dump their goods onto the sand. Instead of gold and spices, mountains of furs. Sable, squirrel, marten. In Europe, kings and bishops pay entire fortunes for such pelts. For the Indians, however, these furs are commonplace, debris that can be obtained in any forest. But what do they want? The natives' eyes burn with greed at the sight of Scandinavian weapons. They reach for the swords and spears. For Stone Age people, a steel blade is the technology of gods, the absolute weapon. At this moment, Thorfinn makes the key strategic decision of his life. He understands, if he gives them steel today, tomorrow those blades will end up in the chests of his men. Karlsefni imposes a strict embargo on the sale of any weapons. Not a scrap of metal must go to the strangers. Instead of swords, he offers them what Scandinavians consider food for the poor and Indians nectar of the heavens. Thorfinn orders the women to bring out vats of milk and porridge boiled in it. For the indigenous people of America, who knew no animal husbandry, the taste of milk and butter struck them to the core. This unseen, exotic delicacy instantly closed the deal. The saga describes this exchange with cynical humor. The Skraelings carried away their purchases in their bellies, and the Vikings carried away their goods in their holds. Thorfinn Karlsefni triumphs. He has pulled off the deal of the century. He exchanged a perishable product for furs that would make him the richest man in Scandinavia. He bought a continent for a bucket of milk. It seemed the perfect balance was found: peaceful coexistence, profitable trade, prosperity. But within this scheme lay a fatal biological error. Thorfinn did not account for one thing. The majority of adult Native Americans suffered from lactose intolerance. What the Vikings considered a treat became poison to the stomachs of the Skraelings. And when the guests began to suffer stomach cramps, they interpreted it not as indigestion, but as deliberate poisoning. The fragile peace bought with milk is ready to collapse, but the catastrophe will be triggered not by the stomach, but by fear. And the source of this fear will be the creature the Vikings considered the most harmless member of their expedition. The history of colonizing an entire continent sometimes collapses, not due to the miscalculations of generals, but because of a single, accidental sound. Trade was flourishing. The Skraelings, captivated by the taste of milk, were giving away valuable furs for next to nothing. But in the height of the exchange, a sharp crash came from the thicket. Breaking through the fence, Thorfinn's breeding bull burst out of the pen. The massive animal, agitated by strange scents, flew into the clearing and let out a deafening roar. For the Norsemen, this cry meant the comfort of a home farm and prosperity. However, the indigenous inhabitants had never encountered a beast larger than a deer. In their eyes, the horned giant, whose voice made the earth tremble, embodied a nightmare from another world. Terror seized the crowd instantly. The Skraelings dropped their goods and rushed to their boats, pulling on the oars as if fleeing from demons. Silence reigned. Thorfinn Karlsefni realized this was only the beginning, a short calm before the real storm. For 3 weeks, the camp languished in tense anticipation, and then the coastal waters changed color. The saga of Eric the Red conveys this moment with chilling precision. A multitude of boats appeared from the south, like a torrent rushing down from the mountains. Canoes filled the horizon, and the water turned black. Now the strangers came not for fur. Their furious howling echoed off the coastal cliffs. The Battle of Hop broke out. The Scandinavians locked their shield wall. They anticipated an easy slaughter. Could wooden spears and stone axes withstand tempered steel and chainmail armor? Thorfinn relied on technological superiority, but fatally underestimated the fury of the enemy. The Strelings did not launch a frontal attack where the Vikings ruled supreme. Instead, they unleashed a hail of stones upon the colonists, and following that, they deployed a weapon that plunged the grim warriors into a stupor. The saga mentions a curious, huge sphere resembling a sheep's stomach of a blue-black color. The Indians hoisted it on a long pole and hurled it into the thick of the battle. Upon landing, the projectile exploded with a thunderous sound. Historians argue about the nature of this find, whether it was a noise trap made of dried skin or an unknown ritual instrument. But the psychological blow was devastating. The Vikings considered themselves invincible masters of the world, and their opponents savages. But the roar of the unknown weapon and the countless horde broke their will faster than swords. The Iron Men of the North, who had conquered Europe, fled in panic from the howling of strange bags. The formation collapsed. Thorfinn and his warband, casting aside pride, retreated upriver, seeking salvation on the rocks. The myth of the Varangians' invulnerability crumbled. Their lives were saved only by a narrow gorge where the numerical superiority of the Strelings lost its significance. When the slaughter subsided, Thorfinn read not joy in the eyes of his men, but a sentence. They realized the cruel truth of this land. Iron Age technologies were powerless before a demographic abyss. The battle died down. The Skrælings retreated into the forests, carrying away their wounded. On the shore lay the bodies of the fallen and the debris of weapons. At this moment, Thorfinn Karlsefni performs an act that distinguishes a great leader from a simple field commander. Instead of celebrating a tactical victory, he conducts a cold strategic audit. He looks at his people, just under 60 men. This is the elite, hardened in battle, armed with the best steel of Northern Europe, but there are only 60 of them. Look at the situation through the eyes of Thorfinn the merchant. He is used to balancing debits and credits. In the assets column, fantastically fertile land, grapes, self-sown wheat, furs, and timber, riches capable of making him a king. In the liabilities column, an adversary whose numbers are unknown, but who is capable of fielding hundreds of fighters daily. Forest dwellers who know every path, an opponent who has nothing to lose. The saga of Eric the Red has preserved for us the brutal conclusion Karlsefni reached. Although this country is attractive, life here will be spent in eternal fear and anxiety due to the hostility of the local inhabitants. Thorfinn believed that superiority in weaponry would ensure security and power over the new land. However, steel can win a battle, but it is powerless against demographics. The Vikings had fallen into a golden cage. They possessed the riches of Vinland, but the price of ownership was a life in armor that could not be removed even in sleep. Thorfinn realizes that Greenland, their only base, is thousands of nautical miles away. There is nowhere to expect reinforcements from. The Greenland colony is tiny itself. It cannot supply men for a protracted war of attrition. Any life lost here in Vinland is irreplaceable. Any wound threatens to become fatal. It was a demographic dead end. The gap between the Iron Age and the Stone Age collapsed in the face of simple arithmetic. The Vikings could exterminate local inhabitants by the dozens, but new hundreds would stand in place of the fallen, and Thorfinn had to count every single man. And then, Thorfinn Karlsefni makes the hardest, but also the wisest decision of his life, a step that goes against the heroic ethos of the Vikings, but fully aligns with the logic of the clan's survival. He gives the order to pack up. Spring 1011 AD. In the Bay of Hope, where battles recently raged, only the creak of rigging is heard now. The Vikings are striking camp. This is not the flight of a defeated army, but an organized retreat with rich loot. Thorfinn Karlsefni personally controls the loading. Leaving empty houses on the shore, he takes everything that has market value. The holds of the Norse are bursting, not with plundered gold, but with resources that are valued in Europe by the weight of precious metals. Into the holds go bales of sable and marten furs. Following them lie stacks of Vinland timber, hardwood, the shortage of which is acutely felt in Greenland and Iceland. Little Snorri also comes up to the deck. The 3-year-old boy running among the sailors does not yet realize his role in history. The first European born in America leaves his homeland, never to return. The ships raise their sails. The road home proves harder than the path to Vinland. The Atlantic collects its toll. Not everyone makes it to Greenland, but Karlsefni's ship cuts the waves confidently. The leader carries not just merchandise, he carries the future of his lineage. There is a surprising irony in this situation. Thorfinn was tormented by thoughts of failure, for the colony did not succeed. However, in reality, the refusal of a hopeless war turned him into the most successful merchant of the era. He lost an entire continent, but gained a fortune that would provide for his descendants for centuries. In Norway, Karlsefni liquidates the cargo he brought back. The sagas have preserved an episode showing the scale of his success. In the port of Bremen, a German merchant offered Thorfinn half a mark of pure gold for just one carved beam from Vinland. The most valuable commodity turned out to be masur wood, likely maple or birch burl. From such material at that time, furniture for kings was created. One piece of wood for the price of a fortune. Thorfinn exchanged the American dream for hard European currency. Returning to Iceland, Thorfinn acquires the vast estate of Glaumbær. He will meet old age in honor and wealth. His son, Snorri, born to the sound of American forests, will begin a great dynasty. It is his descendants who will become the first Icelandic bishops, Thorlak Runolfsson and Bjorn Gilson. Thus ends an era. The Vikings reached the edge of the world, looked beyond the horizon, and retreated. They realized what the rest of Europe would understand only 5 centuries later. America was not just land, but a challenge requiring the might of an entire empire, not the courage of a handful of adventurers. Thorfinn Karlsefni closed the door to the new world, but left it unlocked. Vinland emptied. The longhouses rotted under the rains and winds. However, the legend of rich western lands continued to stir the minds of those who considered Karlsefni overly cautious and believed they could take by force what could not be bargained for with milk. And a new expedition was not long in coming. In the next episode, we will see what happens when not merchants but obsessed madmen set out for the shores of America. Awaiting us is Bloody Sunset, the story of Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red. She will prove the most terrible monsters do not come from the thick of the forest. They arrive on your own ship.